Today I want to talk about social roles and addiction. A lot of you have seen me, maybe on my TED Talk or in things that I've written, talk about how treatment creates addicts rather than curing them. You might have heard me talk about my own experiences, where I say that I didn't feel addicted until after I started going to treatment. Some people think that means I'm blaming treatment programs for my drug use, that I'm saying they made me use drugs, and of course they didn't. I always chose to use drugs every time that I did it, as does every substance user, okay? But I noticed that this institutionalization happens once you get into the system. People tend to get worse. And I've been digging into how that happens, what that means for a long time. And there is a book that really helped me to understand it even better. It put everything into a lot of clarity for me. And that book was The Making of Blind Men by Robert Scott. And the thing that was so great about it is I could see the parallels from what happens in rehab to what happens in the organizations that are there to help blind people. This book was a study of organizations that are meant to help the blind. He spent 3 years studying those organizations. And what he found is that basically they were hobbling blind people. And what he lays out in the book is that being a blind man or a blind person is a social role, a learned social role. Now that isn't to say that people aren't really blind, right? But it's really smart. He makes a separation. He says on the one hand, you have losing sight, having no sight, having difficulty with sight, whatever you want to call it. You can't see well enough to use your sense of sight to do the things you need to do in life. And that's a genuine handicap there. That's a genuine condition. That's something that objectively is a part of a person's life, that they lack sight. But on the other hand, you have this stereotype about blind people, that they're helpless, that they can't do anything for themselves. They can never live to hope, never hope to live a normal life. That because of their blindness, they live in this inner mental world that makes them deeply and darkly emotional, and they become wise of that. And you always see the wise blind man in movies or television, right? There's this whole stereotype. And there's a way that blind people are supposed to behave. They're supposed to be reserved. They're supposed to rely on other people to do everything for them. And they need to be taken care of by the rest of society. They can't do things for themselves. So what Robert Scott said in The Making of Blind Men is that, again, you have loss of sight on the one hand, and you have the learned social role of being a blind man on the other. And he demonstrates how the organizations for the blind teach people to live in that role, incentivize them to live in that role. And then other people in our social world, if we lack sight, they help us get into this role. And he brings up little examples where, if you have somebody who's blind come into your office, you don't know how to handle that situation. You want to run right over, grab them by the hand, walk them to a chair, do everything. You're uncomfortable with the situation, and you feel like you have to help. And that blind people encounter this so often that eventually they just sort of give in and let people do things for them in that way. And that's one way it's socially, they begin to go into the role. It's easier for them to just let everybody walk them around than it is to walk themselves around, right? And when they go to the blindness organizations do everything for them, right? And he detailed all the little ways that they do it, to the point of, they feed them, they try to get them to go there for all their meals, and then they cut up all their food for them, and then just give them a spoon to eat with. They would have activities like they would play bingo in the facility for the blind, and they would have a volunteer there to help. Each and every person had their own volunteer to help them fill out the bingo card as they played. And, he goes on and on about all the ways in which they sort of do everything. And this approach in blindness organizations, and now you got to recognize this is about blindness organizations in the late 60s. This is from 1969, this book. I don't know what they're like today, but from what he studied at the time, that's how they were. And he described their approach and their theory, and this is the thing that set off alarm bells for me. Okay? They called it the accommodative approach, and it means you have to accommodate the disability, right? And so that's why they cut up the food. That's why they have a volunteer there helping with bingo. That's why they tell you, don't go get a job in the real world. Work in this special shop we have where you can assemble brooms or do some other menial task, right, that is specifically designed for a helpless person like you. They accommodate the blindness. So part of that theory is that for the blind, for the person who loses sight, right, let's say, and then goes to the blindness organization for help, for them to make any progress, they have to admit that they are helpless and will never be able to live any semblance of a normal life. That set off alarm bells for me when I read that. And I was kind of, frankly, shocked that the author never made the connection between that and addiction. But I assume he didn't know anything about addiction or what happens in rehabs. But for those who don't know, you go to rehab, and the first step is that you have to agree that you have this disease, that you are powerless, that you're going to be compelled to use substances, and there's nothing you can really do about it. You can never hope to live a normal life, and you need to accommodate that handicap. And what does that mean? Well, you go to rehab for it, and then you get into sober living, where you live with other people that are working on their addiction, and you're away from temptation, right? And you shouldn't go to parties or hang out with friends or go into places where they serve alcohol, or where somebody might have drugs or use drugs, or you can't drive by that part of town where you used to buy drugs. You need to accommodate the condition, just like you need to accommodate the blindness with blind people, right? But what he showed with blind people is that it makes them completely helpless. And he contrasted this with another approach to helping the blind that was mostly used in the military, where they'd have them go to a facility for a short length of time, learn a bunch of skills to deal with being blind. How do you get dressed? How do you cook food? How do you use a cane to sort of navigate and get around? How do you do these things? Maybe learn how to read Braille. And then they send them home to live their lives. They're not sucked into a blindness organization 24/7, 365. They move on. And the people who did that approach functioned better in every way than the people who did the accommodative approach, in which a special world was created for them to accommodate their blindness. They didn't have to agree to the idea that they were forever helpless. They just needed to learn some skills. And the funny thing about that too was that when they compared, things like income, home ownership, involvement in the community, levels of depression, anxiety, they did better than people in the other blindness programs, these veterans. But these veterans did better on all of those counts than cited veterans, right? When they compared them to their own sort of demo who hadn't gone blind. They did better in all these realms of home ownership, community involvement, social relationships, income, all these different things. They were not helpless at all, right? So what he shows there is this idea of the helpless blind person is nonsense. Blind people can be very capable and live their own different but normal life. They can have independence, and they do. But that's not what happens with the ones that go into the programs with the accommodative approach, right? So this gave me a way of understanding addiction and addicts with everything that I've experienced, known, and researched and seen. And I applied that, this sort of the separation that he made. On the one hand, you have loss of sight. On the other hand, you have being a blind man as a social role. And I think the exact same thing applies to addiction. On the one hand, we develop a really strong preference for intoxication, for drug and alcohol use. We really feel like we need it for X, Y, and Z reasons. It's what we want to do, even though we simultaneously hate it. It's what we prefer. We don't want to get arrested. We don't want to develop cirrhosis. Whatever things happen, but we still prefer being intoxicated on these drugs. That's a real and objective thing. We grow and learn that preference, develop that preference until it gets to a point where it's killing us in a way sometimes. So on the one hand, you have the preference for drugs and the experience of intoxication. And on the other hand, you have the social role of the addict. And that you learn from society. You learn from your friends and family who look at you like you're crazy and you can't be trusted, and convey to you that you're out of control. And then you learn it in the rehabs where they tell you all these things. You have a disease, you're out of control, you're going to experience strong cravings, you won't be able to deal with them. So again, get into our system, be constantly under the care of therapists in sober living homes, going to meetings, calling sponsors, staying away from people that use drugs, blah, blah, blah. Let's accommodate this. And in both cases, with the blind and with addicts, it's incentivized. This is very important. We are incentivized to play this helpless role. In the blindness programs, part of the program was that those people there are involved in doling out assistance, financial assistance for rent and other things. And if you didn't accept your blindness and your hopelessness and the fact that you can never live a normal life, you weren't going to make progress. And if you weren't going to make progress, you wouldn't be seen as being worthy of receiving that assistance. And so as a person who has lost sight and gone into the program, you get the message that you better accept your blindness, accept your fate of being helpless and never being able to live a normal life. And if you start showing that acceptance, you're more likely to get this assistance, to get the other things you need. Okay? He also said most people, when they go into blindness programs, all they want to do is learn how to read some Braille, use a cane. They just want to get skills. But even to get those things, it's sort of like you can't move to those things until you've accepted your fate as a blind man. So blind people are incentivized to begin to see themselves this way, or at least to speak it at first. And, my experience is when you start saying something enough, you start believing it. In rehab, in treatment, it's the same thing. everybody around you says you have to accept that you are an addict and that you're going to be triggered, that you're going to deal with this for the rest of your life, that it's hard, that it's impossible, you're always going to be craving, you got to be on the lookout, you have to constantly work on yourself, right? You have to have all the right goals, you got to go to all the right kind of therapists and meetings, you have to be emotionally stable, hang around the right people, you have to do all these things. You have to accept that that is your fate, that you have a lifetime of battling this addiction ahead of you, and that you're helpless. You're not going to be able to exist right on your own. And if you don't accept that, we're just going to keep giving you hell. We're not going to tell the probation officer that you're doing better, or the court, or whoever's looking over you. We're not going to tell your parents that. If you don't accept that you're powerless, you're not making any progress. So the prognosis is bad, right? And when they don't tell all those other people that have strings and are controlling parts of your life, if they don't give them a good report, those people are going to make your life more hell. Your family, the probation officer, whoever is involved, Child Protective Services sometimes. So you get the picture that you had better talk the talk. You better agree that you are a helpless addict. And then you start to believe those things about yourself. You shelter yourself from ever being around alcohol, right? And then that builds the idea, and it builds the fear that, oh my God, what if I end up around alcohol? I'm going to be triggered to drink. Right? And I see this with people all the time who, when they decide to quit drinking, they don't go in any social situations where there'll be alcohol, and they hide. And then as soon as they're in that situation, they blow up, right? Because they've built it up with this fear and made it into a real thing. And then that's what happens to you in rehabs. Is they tell you to live this way, and it's like the blind person letting everybody do everything for them for so long, that they eventually become unable to do those things for themselves. And as an addict, when you live in this situation of letting everybody police you and do everything and sheltering yourself, and you become unable to resist drugs, unable to make your own decisions, unable to ever live a normal life. So I applied this framework in the freedom model, and we dealt with both the preference for intoxication and the social role of the addict. So, people look at the book and they think, well, there's a lot of stuff in here about how addiction theory is wrong and rehabs don't work. Well, why do you have that? Well, it's to get rid of the addict role. To show you, that no, lifelong treatment is not needed. That's a lie. The treatment doesn't even necessarily help. It's a lie that it helps. It's a myth. Maybe lie is a strong word. It's a myth. The people who say these things do really believe them. So we cut through that and we say you don't ever have to identify as an addict again. Even if you use a ton of drugs, if that's your decision in life, is to keep using a ton of drugs, that doesn't make you an addict. An addict is a social role, okay? And it's a person who comes to believe certain things about themselves, that they are helpless, that they're not in control, that they're going to be triggered, all this crap. And all of those things are wrong. The big feature of addiction, one of the big ones, is loss of control. If you ever touch a drop of alcohol or any kind of drug or in the presence of it, you're going to lose control and just involuntarily use. It's nonsense. We give the research in the book that shows that it is, in fact, nonsense. Nobody loses control. So there is objectively no such thing as an addict. It's not an objective thing like loss of sight, right? It's not a thing like a preference that a person has, right? That they've learned to like drugs. It is a bunch of lies. And it's a role that we're taught to play, things we're thought to believe about ourselves that are not true. So we deal with that, and we help people to let go of that addict identity, to resist the coercion to live up to that identity. And then we deal with the preference. Right? Where does the preference come from? Why do you feel this nagging, overwhelming desire to use substances that you're conflicted about? Why do you feel that? Well, we dig into all the reasons. We dig into all the things that we've been taught that drugs and alcohol do for us, and we question all that. Say, does it really do those things? What is its usefulness to you at this point in your life? Let's look at all the benefits of using substances, and let's look at the benefits of not using substances, of using less substances. Let's pick it all apart. And if you do, and you start to see things differently, your preference can change. That's the difference here between this and blindness. As far as I know, blindness isn't reversible yet, but preferences can be changed. People change their preferences all the time. And they change when they get a new perspective. What can help you do that? Information. We provide that information about drugs and alcohol, new ways to think about it, new ways to think about quitting or moderating. You can change that. So, again, the book is The Making of Blind Men by Robert Scott. I love it. It's one of my favorites. There are a few chapters in the middle that are technical about the research process and stuff that are kind of boring, but I highlighted almost everything in this book. I couldn't get enough of it. So I recommend it. Another thing that might be informative and give you a little taste of it, but not the whole thing, is if you look up the This American Life episode on the Batman. It was a guy named Daniel Kish who was blinded at about 1 year old and never got involved with blindness organizations, and his mother let him do whatever he wanted to do, and the result is the guy can ride a bike down a street with cars on it. He can ride a bike. And he does that because he echolocates. He makes sounds and he can understand his surroundings. It's kind of miraculous. I don't think that that's going to happen with everybody. But the point of it, what it suggests is that without the hobbling of the institutions meant to help the blind, a lot of blind people might function better. Or if the blindness organizations just change to giving people a few skills, right? The potential there for functioning better is amazing. And it's the same thing with people with drug and alcohol problems. If nobody ever intervened to tell you that you're powerless, would you come up with that on your own? If you weren't subjected to all of these movies and TVs with storylines about addiction that show people to be helpless, and that it takes tons of work to get over a drug problem and to change, would you believe that about yourself? Probably not. It's something we learn socially because, and I'll tell you, just from being a college kid and a teenager, and using drugs before getting really into trouble with it, I knew the whole time that I was doing what I wanted to do and I was not powerless. I knew I would stop it when I didn't want to do it anymore. You don't, your perspective before you run into recovery concepts is that when you're using drugs, you're just doing what you want to do. And that is the truth of it. But people get so far separated from that truth by the recovery culture that they get confused, they begin to feel powerless and helpless, and they get stuck in place. And then the whole thing becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it exacerbates itself. It sort of proves itself. You start to believe you're helpless, then you behave helpless, and then that serves as proof that you're helpless, and you get in this vicious cycle. You're not. I felt like I was never going to be able to quit using heroin. And I did. You know, and when I did, it was a choice. And I was lucky as hell to run into people who told me that it was my choice and told me how to figure that out and make that choice. And that was Mark Sheeran and Michelle Dunbar and the other people at the Freedom Model Retreats and my co-authors of the Freedom Model for Addictions. I tried to talk about this stuff in the Freedom Model for Addictions, but it was maybe a bridge too far, and I kept editing it, and we had to take it out. But this heavily inspired some of the way that we set up that book. It was heavily inspired by this. I recommend the book. I love it. Thanks for listening. Bye.